Good afternoon to you. I'm Danilo Evangelista, and welcome to our tropical weather outlook video for today, Monday, July 29th, 2024. We are watching a tropical wave in the Atlantic today, potentially to develop as it moves westward, and we've been tracking this for the last several days. Today, the National Hurricane Center is giving it a moderate chance for development by the time it gets to the western Atlantic. Plus, we're also looking at a waking up Pacific. Looks like the Eastern Pacific will finally get its burst of activity that we've been waiting for, and things could get pretty active there, and we could end up seeing maybe two or three named storms over the next week or so as we head into the month of August. We're going to go over all of that today. First, let's start off with the National Hurricane Center in the Atlantic. As I did mention, we do have a moderate chance for a tropical wave in the MDR right now. Has a 50% chance over the next week, and we've been monitoring this for the last several days. It really looks like it's going to get its act together, mostly as it heads into the Western Atlantic by the time it gets to the Bahamas area and just north of the Greater Antilles Islands. And this will be something that we need to watch for the islands and potentially for the southeastern United States as well. Lots of uncertainty in terms of actual track or what type of impacts this will bring, but it definitely looks like there will be some sort of tropical entity that is within this region later this week, and it does look like it does pose a threat of potential development as of right now. In the Eastern Pacific, though, there's more than one area to watch. We have three areas, actually, and it looks like finally the Eastern Pacific is beginning to wake up from its slumber. Looks like all these areas, though, are not going to be any land threatening in any sort of way, at least by the modeling. They all kind of show all of these areas to be moving out to sea, even though we do have one that is off the southwestern coast of Mexico, and it does look pretty close. But I can assure you all of the modeling takes all of these areas out to sea and away from any sort of land. So interests in Mexico, I assume probably the worst you're going to get is swells and high surf along the coast. Those are also impacts too that can be detrimental if you're not careful, especially along the beaches. But if you're a surfer, that's probably good news because there will be much higher waves and you'll probably have a better time surfing anyways. But looks like development nonetheless. A high chance now in the Eastern Pacific, and I think this area right here that is a high chance is now Invest 94E. So we now have the area of interest in the Pacific so that there's more confidence that development will occur. There's also a medium chance that is just below that. Looks like this will be another area to watch right behind whatever develops out of this. And it also looks like a lower chance of development. This is moving into the Central Pacific. Some model support for this, but nonetheless, regardless of whether or not this develops, I wouldn't be surprised if at least two out of three of these areas develop, and it definitely looks like for sure the Eastern Pacific is starting to get more active. Here's a satellite shot of the Atlantic and Pacific. Want to do a combo since we have both Atlantic and Pacific activity to talk about. And you can see there's actually not much happening in the Atlantic right now, besides the area of interest, which is, I think, right around here, right around 50 West. This is the tropical wave in question that we're watching as it moves towards the Western Atlantic. Not much else is going on in the Atlantic, and you can see it's very dry. Even this tropical wave is not very convectively active. But on the other hand, in the Pacific, you could see that there's lots of activity happening. This is probably that area that has a high chance for development, and this is 94E. And you can see it does actually look pretty decent. There's quite a bit of convective activity. Probably is going to develop within the next day or so. And this will probably go off and once again move to the west-northwest away from any sort of land. So that'll be a good thing. But and people have mentioned this before, and they're mentioning about a convectively coupled Kelvin wave that is moving through the Pacific right now. And this is something to keep in mind because the Eastern Pacific, and you can clearly see where this convectively coupled Kelvin wave setup is. In the Eastern Pacific, we have a lot more convection and a lot more of these very convectively active thunderstorms happening in the Pacific. And that is obviously a reflection of this Kelvin wave that is moving through. It acts like fertilizer for these thunderstorms. And as a result, the Eastern Pacific is likely going to get active right now, and we're likely going to see at least a few storms pop up in the Eastern Pacific over the next week or so. But watch, because this Kelvin wave will move west, eventually all of this activity that we see in the Pacific will begin to make its way into the Atlantic, and that'll probably happen as we progress into the months of August. And by the time we get to mid to the latter portion of the months, when we start to ramp up for the peak season, watches all of this convective activity in the Pacific begin to show itself in the Atlantic as well. And I bet you, no matter what, whether or not this area of interest in the Atlantic develops, we will probably see lots of activity come the end of August into the peak of the hurricane season. And I'll actually show you the MJO map in just a little bit. But in terms of activity in the vorticity department, here's actually a really good reflection of our area in the Pacific. Not quite there yet. Obviously, still has some more work to do, but it is a developing invest in the Pacific. And you could also see in the Atlantic as well, the reflection of our tropical wave, also pretty weak at the moment. Once again, it is really more towards the Western Atlantic that we're watching for this to amplify and potentially develop. Wind shear, on the other hand, will also be kind of an issue, although you could see that the wind shear is highest in the Caribbean, and there's also some decent wind shear, although it is lower throughout the Bahamas region. This will lower over the next several days as this wave moves west. It's actually in quite low wind shear environment right now, and it'll probably continue to remain in a fairly low wind shear environment over the next several days, and whatever higher wind shear we have in the Bahamas right now will probably lower. So that'll work in its favor once it gets to that part of the Atlantic in several days. And by the way, in the Eastern Pacific, you can't really see too much of it. Should have brought up the Eastern Pacific version of the wind shear, but you can see the Eastern Pacific has very low wind shear, and obviously that'll help work in favor of the area of interests that we have there, which will probably develop over the next several days as well. Sea surface temperature anomalies, I mean, that's not a concern in either basin, especially in the MDR, just really warm all throughout the deep tropics, even extending into the Bahamas and general Western Atlantic. Areas are solidly above normal, at least a zero point 0.5 to even a degree Celsius above normal in other areas. Yesterday, I showed you the tropical cyclone heat potential, which represents all of the energy below the surface. That is also very high through the entire region as well. So there's lots of energy to work with, even in the Gulf too. And this will be something that we especially need to watch as we get into late August, whenever we do get that, those are the typical kind of late August development that occurs in the Atlantic, or at least it has been over the last several years. The Gulf is very, very warm for that, and also off the southeast coast too, where this area of interest really seems to kind of be manifesting the most, at least in the models right now. But then generally, Atlantic is very warm, and even in the Eastern Pacific too. The tropical Eastern Pacific is on the warmer side right now. Very widespread sea surface temperature anomalies there that are also warm too. The equatorial Pacific is a little bit of a different story, obviously, because we are in ENSO neutral conditions right now, and will probably be in ENSO neutral throughout the rest of the year, and eventually progress towards La Nina. That we'll talk about, though, a little more in depth at a later time, because I do actually have a few things to say about what's going on with the ENSO state right now, namely the fact that we've kind of been in ENSO neutral for a while, and we're kind of headed towards La Nina a little bit slower than I thought we would be for this hurricane season. But we're in ENSO neutral nonetheless, and we're definitely not going to get an El Nino to occur. But on the other hand, the tropical Eastern Pacific is still pretty warm, and that'll probably work in its favor once again as we have this convectively coupled Kelvin wave move through from the Pacific and eventually into the Atlantic. Once again, we'll probably see lots of activity stirred up in the Pacific. And I'll actually show you right now on the velocity potential, the MJO map. You could see, once again, just if you're not familiar, the oranges and the yellows, these yellow, orange, reds represent sinking air. in the velocity potential. This represents less, favorable upper level environment. And then the blues and these greens represent rising air. And notice in the Pacific right now, especially as we head towards the next several days, we kind of have this west to east motion of this rising air cell that moves across the Pacific. This is that Kelvin wave that we're talking about that'll probably allow for quite a bit of activity in the Pacific over the next several days. But as we get towards mid-August, and you can actually see the time scale on this side, that eventually moves through the Pacific, and that'll eventually move into the Atlantic by the time we get to mid-August, and it kind of helps set up some sort of pretty nice standing wave of rising air over Africa. And that is all very favorable. And notice the time frame once again that occurs around mid-August, and that is just around the corner to the start, or at least to the climatological ramp up of the hurricane season. So the Pacific is going to get active. Now we're going to have probably quite a few named storms, and then you could also see that there's also some rising motion action going on in the Atlantic right now. That probably is what's helping our tropical wave that is there. Although I'm not entirely sure, but bottom line, we have a lot of activity in the Pacific, and I'd say in terms of longer term, more significant activity in the Atlantic. Once again, watch to mid-August because that's when it'll really start to get interesting. So you know what, since we are talking about Eastern Pacific activity, before we get to the Atlantic area, let's actually start off in the Eastern Pacific, and just to show you the activity that is going to happen over the next several days. And you can see it takes a little bit of time for this area off of Mexico to develop, but the GFS does develop this storm, does actually become, within the next 5 days or so, does become a pretty formidable system. And then there's this other area that is to the south of it. That's probably that other moderate chance, and that also too becomes a pretty formidable system. And then you also have this piece of energy too that tries to develop as well. And from that, over the next 7 to 10 days, that is at least two more systems that develops in the Eastern Pacific. So we're definitely going to see an increase in Eastern Pacific activity, while in the Atlantic, on the other hand, you could see when it comes to that tropical wave, the GFS on the 12Z run, not too enthusiastic about it. Once again, as I mentioned yesterday, it's really been the European that's been the most aggressive on this storm. The GFS has kind of showed a weaker solution where this remains near the islands, and you could see that the wave energy kind of reflected on the model. It stays through the Greater Antilles, probably lots of land interaction that really prevents it from developing north of the islands around the Bahamas, which that's what the European more or less shows. But it does try to develop it in the Gulf. You kind of see that once it gets towards the northern Gulf, it tries to consolidate a little bit. And then the GFS does this weird thing where it kind of stalls out just north of the Gulf Coast near the Mississippi, Louisiana area, and kind of just stalls there and eventually develops. This is getting towards the 7 to 10 day time frame though. And the GFS is not always that great in that time frame. But the GFS does show some development, at least with this area, as opposed to the European. Let's really quickly go to the 12Z European, which is actually loading. This is the more solid solution that I actually think the Canadian is starting to get on board with. And I'll show you the Canadian in just a little bit. But the 12Z European shows the stronger solution, brings us north of the Greater Antilles into the Bahamas, and as a result, looks like on the 12Z run, just seeing this right now, along with all of you that is watching, looks like this actually brings us into the southeast, which is why I do say that this should also be an area of concern that I think anyone generally within the southeast should keep an eye on, as well as the islands. Because one thing I do want to mention, if we really quickly go back to the GFS, I just want to bring your attention to the relative humidity, is regardless of whether or not this develops, this will definitely bring lots of rain. You can see on the relative humidity chart, this is the outline of the tropical wave. And while it does stay into the Greater Antilles and doesn't really have a chance to develop into a tropical system, it will bring lots of tropical moisture with it to the Greater Antilles, and that'll in and of itself be a threat of gusty winds, heavy rain, and that'll probably cause flooding concerns as well. That is enough weather already to be an inconvenience, regardless of whether or not this is a full-blown tropical system. And then whatever energy of that makes it into the Gulf, obviously, will also be a concern for rain and heavy winds in the Gulf too. So, nonetheless, whether or not this does develop, this will probably bring some inconvenient weather to the northern Caribbean islands, no matter what, into the later portion of this week into early next week. But then we have models like the European, which show a lot more of an aggressive solution where they do actually develop this and make this a potential concern as a tropical system for the southeast. So lots on the table when it comes to what will occur. We'll definitely be watching this system over the next several days. By the time once it really starts to get going, it's really still beyond the 5-day time frame. And obviously, if you know tropical tracking, when it comes to tracking hurricanes, 5 days is basically an eternity. So much can change within 5 days. So we still have lots to watch with this wave in the Atlantic. And obviously, on top of that, Eastern Pacific activity, which looks like, once again, we might get a few Eastern Pacific storms. All are going to remain out to sea for now, but you never know with that too. We might have one that gets awfully close to Mexico, and that could be a concern to talk about as well. Obviously, there's still people in Mexico. It's not just everybody in the Atlantic. We still have people that probably watch from Mexico as well. So obviously, we should watch. We will be watching that activity whenever it does happen too. Lots to go over right now. Definitely more than over the last week or two that we have on our plate now. And trust me, as we progress into August, it'll only get more active from here on out, especially in the Atlantic. With that being said, though, I'm going to end it off for today. Hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, I would really appreciate if you like, comment, subscribe. If you have any questions, put them in the comments too. I'll be more than happy to respond to them. With that being said, hope you have a safe day, a blessed one as well. Peace, love, and kindness to you all, and we will talk again tomorrow.